Hi, HR Nation, it's Chris Rainey. Welcome to HR Leaders, the show where we interview today's most successful and innovative HR practitioners 5 days a week. Today, we're joined by David Doe, who's the Vice President of Talent Excellence at Shell. David, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good, thank you very much. After such an introduction, that's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, you definitely won the award for the best dressed guest.
Oh, thank you. As I said, I'm channeling my inner Steve Arnott. For those of you that are line of duty fans.
And for those that aren't are just listening that right now, you're gonna have to watch the video to understand. So, before we jump in, David, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself personally and your journey to where we are today.
Okay. I'm a historian by background in terms of what I studied at university. So have absolutely no HR qualifications. So I predicate everything I'm about to say with that.
Good intro.
But essentially, I joined Shell 16 years ago. So I'm probably a little bit of an oddity in the sense that I've had my career essentially with one company, but done about 8 different jobs in that time. So I joined Shell in 2003. I've worked in HR supporting a manufacturing site, a refinery, and then went on to be the HR manager of one of the largest IT transformation projects anywhere in industry at that time. I don't think they actually knew what they'd given to me at the moment that
oh my God.
gave it. And then I did some stuff in talent, moved from there into trading, so gas and pipeline trading and LNG trading. And that was a fascinating time because if you remember the Japanese tsunami,
Mm-hmm.
It was one of those occasions where one part of our business was in LNG trading, and effectively the market opening up as a result of that was something completely unexpected. And it's one of those instances where a world event changes something quite substantively. So to be around for that was quite interesting. And then from there, I actually came out of HR. I did a sort of bag carrier job for our country chairman for the UK, so the chairman of Shell UK, because we're primarily listed here in the UK. And then I moved abroad and I was the HR VP of Innovation, Research and Development, so looking after kind of the front end of our innovation technology funnel. And we bought BG at that time, so I was involved in integrating the technical part of BG into Shell, and also into the creation of a single technology organization for the company. And then from there, I went and did some work looking at our people strategy for about 6 to 9 months. And actually some of that's still ongoing. And as of October last year, I became the VP of Talent Excellence, which sounds like a very grand title.
It does, doesn't it? It's exciting.
But essentially it means I run the COE for talent for our company across the globe.
Fantastic. What a journey. And first and foremost, I can't let you skip over the fact that how did an historian get into HR? You can't skip that part.
Well, so, I mean, actually really interesting. If you look at our CHRO, he's a historian.
Really?
If you look at our, actually a number of the members of our HR executive, they've all got history degrees, including my boss. So you start to think, well, actually, maybe I picked the right degree.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's by coincidence, but actually I think, you know, as you look back at things, you're always learning a little bit from the past and thinking about human behavior. And a lot of what I was doing in terms of the stuff that I studied was always thinking about what the motivations were of leaders, you know, how the different interplays of things happen. So I guess there's a connection, and I quite like people. So in the end.
But tell me more about the role now. Very exciting. Obviously, you've been in the role for sort of 7-8 months, if I'm not mistaken. Tell us a bit more about your current focus and, you know, what's really occupying your mind on a day-to-day basis now.
Yeah, sure. So we've actually got quite a busy agenda. So we in October of last year, we actually redesigned the HR function. And one of the things we want to look at is refreshing our approach to our people strategy. Now it's, you know, actually making distinctive people choices in support of our business strategy. And that's actually quite hard to do. And from a talent perspective, that's one of the themes that we've chosen. So there's a number of things going on in my space. We're refreshing our approach to leadership, potential identification. It's a process that we run since the 1960s. In many respects, we invented the process. It's actually still the process that the Singaporean government uses. But insights have moved on in terms of latest research around when it's appropriate to identify. So there's a big piece of work going on that. There's a substantial piece of work around refreshing our approach to integrated strategic workforce planning, and that's in support of driving better organizational productivity, and also thinking about the capabilities we need for the future. And we'll talk a bit about that, I think, later on, as well as looking at the realities of the future of work. So I talked a little bit about people strategy. One of the things that we're looking at is, how do you adapt to the new realities of work? And in an environment which is so quickly changing, what is it that we need to do there? So, I'm looking at that as well. We're in the midst of rolling out Workday, so thinking differently about succession planning. So in many respects, it's a great time to come into this role. If there was ever a time to do this job, it's now, because I've got a lot of things that I can play with, if you want.
So share more on terms of your journey towards total workforce planning.
Yeah, okay. If I wind the clock back a little bit and give some context, I mean, our industry is cyclical, so the oil price goes up and down, and typically with that comes resourcing goes a little bit boom and bust. Now it's very expensive, you get the war for talent, you tend to chase the cycle, and there's a very important, apart from the cost element, there's also a moral element that you need to address there, which is ultimately if you're hiring and then you end up laying off, there's that huge emotional sort of element that you need to look at. And also, from a social responsibility point, we actually need to think about how we do that better. So one of the things we've been looking at is how do you manage the workforce more efficiently through the cycle? And back in 2015, we decided to try and standardize the way we did operational workforce planning. I have to say, the reality is that we probably weren't that successful at that. But what we have done more recently is look at what are the sort of key productivity metrics that will drive organizational performance, and started to think about how do you focus on those and setting mid-term targets, 3-year targets around what you want to achieve. And that's in 4 areas. So for us, it's how we deal with our organizational health around spans and layers. It's around how we're dealing with our offshore workforce, how we move work to be non-proximate, how we manage our expatriate population, so actually being more purposeful in that regard, and then also how we do our contingent workforce. And so we've basically introduced something which gives our HR function more upfront insight into those 4 areas, and they get front-loaded data which talks about the gap to potential in those areas. But it's then for each of the business units to determine what they want to do, what targets they're going to set in their specific business context. And so they will set a set of a mixture of qualitative and quantitative targets, if you want, in relation to those. At the same time, they need to come up with a more detailed operational workforce plan, which basically is the detail that you need for the actual, planning and resourcing for the coming year. And one of the things we wanted to move away from was this supply-demand analysis that we'd done in the past, because as I've said, that typically led to overhiring. And actually, if you think about it, if you do these long-term plans, number one, if you look at sort of forecasting, and there's a good book actually by Tetlock and Gardner on super forecasting, and they talk about the accuracy of long-term economic forecasts. And there's a great quote, and it compares sort of forecasts that are sort of beyond 18 months, approaching 3 years, as sort of approaching dart-like chimpanzee throwing accuracy, i.e., if it's accurate, it's by chance. It's not, there isn't any science that is behind it. And so by focusing on stuff that you can think about in terms of how you drive productivity, but avoiding the detail and the wasted effort on really detailed FTE planning, we've saved a lot of time and effort. At the same time, we're now looking at our operational workforce plans and thinking, do you need to do the line by line analysis, or actually do you start to take it at a more aggregate level, which still
Mm-hmm.
gives you the financial controls, but and still gives you the insight from a skill pool perspective in terms of what you need for the next year, but doesn't waste a huge amount of time in terms of granular detail, which frankly you don't later use when some circumstances change
Yeah.
during the middle of the year. So that's the kind of journey we've been going on, and we are starting to explore how we will bring digital in as a fifth lever.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's up to the businesses as well to think about what else they want to do. So multi-skilling for some of our businesses in the workforce is one of the productivity levers that we're looking to do. How do you get people to take on more tasks than they have done before? But that's not for every business. So it's a framework, and it gives a degree of flexibility.
Yeah. And I appreciate what you're talking about is very specific also, some of the areas to your own business. But looking at the journey you've been on so far, any advice you'd give to other other organizations that are going to be going down a similar route over the next, or currently on that journey? Because I know many of the people listening and our listeners are on a similar journey within their own businesses.
It is a long-term journey. You can think that you're going to get there very fast. For us, one of the challenges is the sheer number of legacy infrastructure
I can only imagine. Yeah.
and the different planning approaches. So I think a piece of guidance I'd say is, to get this right, you need to start to have a shared vision, not only between HR and finance, but also with your procurement function. For contractors, it's also with real estate in terms of access, and then also with IT.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be thinking through, what order you do things in, and how the systems you've currently got are interconnected. Because again, you can think that you're going to go ahead and deliver one of the products and then find it's got a connection somewhere else. So the sequencing of what you do things in, and recognize it's going to take time. And then I think there's a huge amount of low-cost experimentation you can do. So we're doing something on total workforce planning, which is Excel and macro-based at the moment. But then we're looking at, rather than developing a system integration at this stage, because as I say, that's going to be 2-3 years out, is looking at how we might use Power BI to provide some of the modeling insights, so that you have a means of transitioning, starting to move the conversation away from headcount, which can be a bit more of it's a useful control, but towards a more commercially focused conversation, which says, okay, what do I need to do in terms of my build and borrow choices, and what are the employment aspects that I need to take into consideration? And so that's a sort of maturing of the thinking. You don't necessarily need to wait for the full integration of the systems to make progress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I see a lot of people, we were speaking about before, I see a lot of people doing that rather than starting where you are with Power BI and Excel. They're going straight in for the new shiny tool.
And I think that the thing is, at the moment, that this space is evolving so rapidly. So, go back a few years, and the gig economy was not in the same place as it is today. There's a lot more products coming to market. At the same time, some of those products are being bought up by the likes of, the big HCM systems out there. And then they're thinking about how they incorporate them into their journeys. And so there's an element of kind of, looking at the landscape and working out what's coming, and starting to think through what your functional requirements are. And as I say, I think in some respects it's better to sit back and say, okay, how does this relate to my enterprise performance management framework in finance, planning and appraisal? How does it relate to a VMS system for contingent? How does it relate to the HCM system? And then build the kind of roadmap around what you want to do, and then think through how you can make progress in advance of a big system solution.
Yeah. And by the way, what is the difference between operational workforce planning and strategic workforce planning?
So for me, the strategic workforce planning bit is very much related aspirationally to those sort of productivity targets. The operational bit very much comes into that detailed FTE number and the talent insights that you would have, and your graduate targets and your resourcing targets. So the strategic workforce plan doesn't have, other than a very top line number, anything in for it in terms of FTEs, but it does have targets on spans and layers. It does have an offshoring percentage. It does have an expatriate percentage. It knows which markets you're wanting to look at for expatriation. You know how you want to use contingent workforce, but it doesn't have the detail that you would have in
Okay,
that
with you.
operational 1-year plan. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, could you talk more about bringing contingent into the workforce planning?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is a journey we've been on for a few years, and we're trying to accelerate. I mean, I think one of the big things is that we haven't had full visibility of our contingent. So we know we've got roughly 24,000-ish contractors with physical access, either physical access to our building or access to our IT infrastructure. The key thing is actually to get them into a VMS system and then actually start to think about how you categorize the work they're doing against your job catalog. So you can start to compare like for like, because often what you find is with contractors is that the resource is already pre-identified by the line manager. There isn't really a conversation over rates. It's somebody they know, or there isn't that commercial insight. So by bringing it into the VMS system and by starting to be able to compare job grade and skill pool, you can start to have a more commercially focused conversation. Your CP function can start to think about, how they actually get more competitive rates. In some respects, also, by the way, it's helping us to think about our own salary benchmarking and
Of
how that,
course. Yeah.
So it's a bit of a journey, and it's one that we haven't finished. And what we're doing this year is bringing the costs and making them more transparent to a certain section of our workforce. So we're doing a number of pilots where we're actually putting the costs alongside each other. We're giving more detailed advice on sort of co-employment risks. And actually that's starting to lead to different conversations and different outcomes. So we're not there yet. I think it's something that we need to evolve, and the reality is that you need to start to think about not only whether the work is done by a human or automation, but then also if it is a human, does that resource sit on your balance sheet? If it does sit in your balance sheet, is it physically located in your normal locations, or are you going to use offshoring? And I think a lot of this is fluid at this moment in time. I think it's one of the reasons why it's interesting to be in this line of work at this moment in time as well.
Yeah, but at the same time, I haven't heard anyone really talk about it, which one is why I wanted to ask you that question. Yeah. But I'm assuming maybe it's so early on and not many people are focusing that much on it or have much experience. Would that be the case?
Yeah, I think on contingent, you are starting to see companies thinking about this space, and I think a number of companies are on the same journey.
Okay.
And so I attended a roundtable conversation on this very topic with a few different European-based companies only last year.
Okay.
And I think we're all sort of trying to feel our way into this a little bit. The systems piece is a challenge.
Yeah.
The modeling piece is a challenge. The planning and appraisal piece is a challenge. And then not only are you thinking about it purely from how many of these resources do you need? Is it build or borrow? But also then how do you think about assessing the quality of your contractor workforce? Do you want to give them a star rating like Uber does? And should they do that for you? And should you start to develop more of an assignment value proposition for contractors? I think also what we're starting to see is more of a conversation around alumni, which actually consultancies have done very well for a number of years, but for our industry hasn't really been something that we've done in a big way. So I think this space is evolving. And as I say, that's one of the interesting areas. And why it's evolving so rapidly, if you think about it in a little bit, is because of how much technological evolution there's been in the past few years. So think back to 2007 and the introduction of the iPhone, and actually how that's now enabled the gig economy and people to pick up work on demand. That just wasn't present. And it's amazing to think that projections say that 40% of the US workforce will be gig economy by the end of 2020. I mean, that's an amazing change in the employee
Yeah.
landscape.
It's pretty crazy. Even as a startup, we see it ourselves. Now I'm using things like Fiverr.com. If I want a new intro made for a video, or want something, an update on our website, or whatever it may be, I can just message someone on Fiverr.com. In a matter of hours, they've done it. It's sorted. It's just unbelievable how quick and easy it is, and communicating with those people through an app on my phone. It's just, now we take that for granted of how easy to access those skills from anywhere and anywhere, anytime, any device. We can access that set of skills on anything you possibly need. To be honest, there's people that I've come across that do very specific niche things that I never would have come across. That there's someone there who can do that. It's absolutely incredible. On the point of sort of the changing workforce, obviously millennials, Gen Z will soon comprise 50% of the workforce.
Yeah. Sure.
How do we leverage the macroeconomic trends to review and evolve our people model?
I'm constantly asked, what do millennials want, and how should we react to
They want the same as everyone else.
And you're right. Okay. And so I think there's a lot of populist literature out there around millennials and different generations. But actually, if you go back and look at the academic research on this, what you'll find is that when they look at surveys, and not every survey that you see finds generationally based differences in the workforce, but some of the problems with the ones that do is they confuse age, so i.e. what stage of life you're in, the period, so i.e. the context around what's going on at that moment in time, and cohort, so people with shared experience. And typically, kind of a lot of the research in this space, or a lot of the surveys, have been very Western focused, and they haven't looked cross-generation, and they haven't looked cross-culturally. There's a really good book by Deal and Levinson called What Do Millennials Want? And that does look across the boundaries. And they give some really good insights around what will motivate and engage millennials. But then they make the observation that actually millennials in many ways are very striking in terms of their preferences to every other generation. And millennials will age just like the rest of us. And I say that, I'm on the cusp of, I was born in 1980, so I'm right on that millennial cusp, if you want. And from that perspective, there really isn't a reason for why different generations would think differently. What is causing the changes in the workplace, if you want, are more of the societal, technological, political, and economic stuff. So I come back to the point around the iPhone and how that's changed the interaction in terms of the way in which you engage with work. If you think about what's happened to retirement ages in many countries over recent years, what's happened to pensions, what's happened in terms of the stagnation of wages. There are a huge number of things which are coming in. If you now start to also think about the advent of 24-hour news in the past 20 years, and how that's increasing transparency, and therefore how purpose and meaning becomes more important, all of these things are impacting everybody. Now, how that impacts you differs on your stage of life and where you are. So if you're single versus having, that moment that matters, if you get married or then if you have children, that starts to change your perspective. So I think it's really important to understand what's going on at the macroeconomic level and start to try and adjust to that. And as I say, I think that is one of the key inflection points. That's one of the reasons why we've started to look at our people model again. Rather than sort of blame it just on different generations. They just think differently, because it's not true. Having said that, technology is already starting to make people think differently, if you want, around how you access information. So in the past, if you ask someone a question, a maths question, or if you ask them to find something out, many people would fall back on their sort of professional skill set and start to work it out in their heads. Actually, now most people would think, how do I find that? How do I Google it? So that is changing some of the fundamental understanding that many people have, and the kind of bedrock of professional competence. But that's not because we've evolved differently. That's because the information is there and it's easier to access.
Yeah. Well, on the point of leadership then, the bar's so high now in terms of leadership and performance continuously being raised. How do you guys continue to compete, especially in your own industry where there's a very small pond of talent, and it's very even more important
there's a few answers here. One is around the type of leadership you've got. I think you can try and do analysis to say, well, what's the gap in terms of your current approach to other companies or to external benchmarks. And I think there's a challenge in that, which is that if you've invested a lot in creating a system, actually by going back and doing a kind of here's your good bits or here are your bad bits, that's not that helpful, because your company has been successful up to a point because of the leaders it's got. It's somewhat actually, in some respects, in my mind, slightly disrespectful and isn't leveraging the strengths you've got. But having said that, the challenge that we've got in the next, particularly in our industry, in the next 15, 20 years is quite substantial. So we've got the energy transition and we've got digital. And so in many respects, for us, the next 20 years are going to see more change than we've had in the last 50. And so from that perspective, you need to think about the context and kind of what got you here won't get you there. And therefore, it's not necessarily about the strengths and weaknesses of your current approach for your current context. It's actually more around what is the context for the future. And so from our perspective, I think it is about having leaders with more of an outside-in perspective. So when we are making decisions, is it ethical? Is it legal? But more importantly, is it wise? How will it go down externally? There are certain things that might make you money, but actually aren't wise to do. Then also you need to think about how you lead through the digital context. So not necessarily all leaders need to become data scientists, but at the same time, they need to understand how to leverage digital and how to work in agile environments, just as much as they need to still, in some instances, be able to work in a more waterfall style, because where you've got large capital projects, you're not going to make everything agile. You need leaders who are going to have the ability to create followership, who can drive sustained performance, consistent performance, and be constantly wanting to look externally and raise the bar. So I think the challenges that we've got going forwards are different to the ones which we face today. And I think that in a way helps you to articulate that and overcome some of the barriers of resistance. So that's one aspect. I think in terms of performance, there's an element around actually looking externally and saying, and our CEO says this around, our plans need to be credible, competitive, and affordable. So it's not necessarily about saying, how do I beat last year's plan? You need to be looking at what the competition are doing and thinking about how you can develop and stretch in the context of what the external market's doing. And not hockey sticking things, but actually being much clearer around your planning. And then setting goals which are clear around what is on target and what stretch. So that there's that aspect. And then there's the aspect around how you drive organizational productivity, which we've talked about through kind of workforce planning. And I think in the future, we'll be looking about productivity. We'll be looking a little bit around what is the potential disruption. And then we'll be thinking more about skills, and skills are rapidly evolving in this. So how do you drive productivity? You probably know a number of aspects around your current business model, but where's the disruption coming from? How's that going to disrupt your current business models? And how are skills evolving? And how do you make sense of that?
Mm-hmm. I don't envy your job. So that's what I was thinking for that whole moment there, is how you're balancing the current with the future. And I love the way you put that in terms of it's not about changing the leadership that you have right now, because that's what's got you to where you are. However, you still also need to be looking towards the future and planning there. How do you balance both of those in terms of developing leaders you already have whilst hiring for the future?
So, I mean, we've had a long tradition of looking at leadership potential. So we still hire for leadership potential. Now, no assessment methodology is ever going to be 100% accurate.
Yeah.
So I think, what happens is you need to get people in the door, and you need to provide them meaningful development. And for us, it's also about how we get them as quickly productive in the field, particularly technically. So we talk about time to autonomy quite a bit. But in the early phases, what we're looking at is how you really use performance as the passport to opportunity, and then think about how you identify individuals early talent, and then give them the right development opportunities. So we've got a limited number of expatriate opportunities that, we need to be thinking about how we're using them for early talent as well as for, existing talent and to get
Mhm.
global leadership. And then I also think you need to be really clear where early integrative leadership experiences are, because I think the days where people thought there was a perfect organizational design, which would, you either need to be local or global or,
Yeah.
are gone. I mean, the reality is that, there isn't a perfect organizational design. And a lot of this now comes down to the abilities of leaders to integrate across different business interfaces, across the global local divide. And the best way to do that is to give people as early on experience as you can. So selecting earlier on through succession planning and actually succession pools and thinking about who are the right people, which markets, etc., is something that becomes increasingly important.
Well, look, that leads us quite nicely onto the quickfire round. I'm going
Yeah,
to ask you 5 questions,
sure.
and you have no longer than 30 seconds to give us some
Oh,
amazing answers.
crikey. Okay.
um, everyone's always like, "Oh my god!" What was the number one thing that was holding you back from becoming a senior HR leader?
Okay, so I mean, I think I've been very lucky, and I've had some great line managers. So in some respects, I don't think I've been held back by the company. If anything, it's kind of insecurity, in all honesty, and that can, in many respects, demonstrate itself as overconfidence, and a little bit of fear around failure and whether I'm good enough. Imposter syndrome. We talked about that
Yeah.
earlier.
Hmm.
And for me, actually, one of the grounding things has been actually having kids of my own, and actually relaxing a little bit and thinking about what's important in life, and realizing there's more to life than work. And that actually helps me a little bit to deal with it.
What's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
So I go back to, I shared an office with a guy called Howie, right back at the start of my career, and he talked about investing in relationships, and the little things really matter. Don't treat relationships, particularly in business, as transactions, but invest in them, because you never know when you'll need someone, and actually people really appreciate when you have invested in them and are more willing to give back. And that's really stayed with me. And I think he was absolutely right. It's a cornerstone for industrial relations, but actually more generally, just for getting stuff done.
Yeah.
Um, he's a guy that I really admired.
Amazing. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but what books would you recommend to our audience, and why? Don't have to be HR related, of course.
No, so the book that I choose would be Nudge. So it's a book actually around behavioural economics. Richard Thaler wrote it, one of the Nobel Prize winning economists, and it talks a little bit around how you can nudge behaviour through little things. And one of the examples that he uses in a later book is what they did with UK tax returns. So they literally changed the wording in the sort of first reminder that you have, which instead of saying you're late on your tax return, people in Manchester, 98% of people in Manchester pay their tax returns on time. You're in the 2% that haven't. And they had a sort of 25% uplift in the number of people that would then actually return their tax return within that first reminder window. And I think if you can think about how you then apply that type of context within HR, that's really important, because so often our processes are well designed, but actually what happens is behavior gets in the way, and you need to think about how you can nudge behavior, if you want, to support your
Yeah.
processes without becoming too paternalistic. So I'm really interested in that type of thinking.
It's on my list. You've already given it to me. It's
Yeah.
there. I'm really excited about that one. And also, what I took away from that one is the main thing, to be honest, is just so small. You can make those small changes that have a massive difference. It don't cost anything. It's just a rewording. The fact that they just reworded that, and obviously the return on investment is huge, right? As well.
Absolutely.
You mentioned a few earlier as well, but what internet resources do you use to, again, you mentioned Google Scholar, or any others that you use to say
Well, I look at resources like your own. I think they're great. I think the areas where you're able to very quickly access information and access the kind of meta level analysis is really helpful. So I think, I'm not just saying that because I'm on your podcast, but I think
I'll pay you later.
what you've done is great. But then thereafter, what I want to do is then go and read the background behind it. So what I tend to do is use a resource like yours, and then I'll go and actually look for, okay, that's given me an idea.
Yeah.
How do I then go into Google Scholar and access the kind of empirical research that might back it up or debunk the theory? And I find that using those type of things in combination very, very helpful indeed.
Yeah.
I can't read everything, so you work out where you're interested and then you go deep.
What's one thing around your current role, the business, that you're most excited about?
So I'm really excited around the opportunity and the amount of change that's coming up. And I say that because I think if you look at the challenge we have as a society, actually providing more and cleaner energy solutions is probably one of the biggest challenges humanity faces right now. So, on the one hand, you want to ensure that there's still economic growth that lifts people out of poverty all over the world, but you also need to do that in a way which is sustainable and, more importantly, stays within the sort of 1.5 degree Paris climate agreement. And what I see us doing in terms of is really trying to think about how we do that. We've come out with some announcements around our net carbon footprint reduction and actually linking it to executive pay. But I also, frankly, we're looking at how our portfolio is and what our portfolio is and the makeup of our portfolio and what we do in the new energy space. So there's a huge amount of change going on, and it's one of the most important problems that we have facing us. And there's a great opportunity to be part of the solution. And I really believe we're committed to doing the right thing and trying to balance these challenges. And it's not easy. It really isn't easy, but it's something that really gets me out of bed in the morning. I really find meaning and purpose in it.
Yeah. Well, nothing worth doing is ever easy.
No.
Let's be honest. And it's great. I'm sure everyone listening as well can hear the energy and passion you have for what you do. And you are really a natural born storyteller. By the way, you should have your own podcast in the future. You definitely have a good way.
That's blowing smoke.
No, you do.
Yeah.
You do have a good way of words. Like,
Yeah.
I think, and that's one of the reasons why in our original conversation, I was like, I need to get you on the show, David.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we've kind of just touched on the surface level. I'm sure there's going to be so many people listening now that may have some questions for you after as well. But thank you so much for joining us on the show. You definitely give us some great actionable advice, and our listeners will be a lot better off for it. So I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Before we wrap up, if there's sort of one parting piece of advice you could give to sort of other HR leaders that are on their journey, kind of what would that be?
I think from my perspective, it's always around looking to push the boundaries of what you can do. So I've never taken a job and said, right, okay, here's the confines of the job and this is what I do. So I think for me, it's a little bit around seeing where you can add value, and being willing to take a risk and being willing to make associations. What I come back to what I said before, it isn't necessarily about inventing something completely new. It's about spotting the connections between things that other people may not have done and thinking how you can create value out of that. And for me, that's worked very well. But so that's the one piece of advice I would give. Be interested in the shiny things out the corner of your eye and think through how you can make connections, because that's actually where you can find new solutions.
Fantastic, David. Well, for everyone listening, guys, as always, if you head over to hrleaders.com, there you'll find the show notes from this episode. Everything that David's mentioned will be linked in the description for you to make life easier. Apart from that, David, thank you so much for joining us. And I wish you all the best until we next speak. And I'm sure I'll be speaking to you again soon anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Chris.